Welcome to Candid Catholic Convos, a program brought to you by the Catholic Diocese of Harrisburg. Our mission is to humanize the Church and help you to grow in your faith, love, and understanding. I'm your host, Rachel Trochet, a cradle Catholic who's only human and struggled with faith on more than one occasion. Each week, you'll hear engaging, down-to-earth interviews and actionable strategies you can implement into your life with ease to help you grow closer to God. If you're ready to open your heart and step fully into the person God created you to be, then you're in the right place. Let's get started. Hey, hi, hello, and welcome to another episode of Candid Catholic Convos. This week has been a busy one for our family. Spring sports are wrapping up. The school year is almost over. We're getting all of our routine checkups done and out of the way. And we're also preparing for my husband to leave again for another training mission. It's part of being a military family that there's a lot of travel involved for my husband. And thankfully, most of the places he travels to are relatively safe. He gets to learn some pretty cool things about his job. And most of the time, he has a chance to explore the area he's in as well. By now, he's been all over the country, probably most of the 50 states. I lost count a while ago. But he also spent a large chunk of time overseas in different countries. I, on the other hand, am not nearly as well traveled. I've been out of the country once for our honeymoon and have traveled to a handful of states, but that's about it. I do have a travel bucket list, though, of places I want to visit before I die. And most of them are places that I don't want to just visit, but I want to be changed by them. Like, I want to go to Machu Picchu and hike the Incan Trail. And I want to go to Italy and traverse on the same streets my ancestors did. Heck, I'd even love to take a road trip down Route 66 and see all the forgotten cities of our country. It's that old cliched but still true saying, it's about the journey, not the destination. But as Catholics, our destination is ultimately heaven, right? Our journey should be about finding the best path to holiness and eventually heaven. So how do we do that? How can we explore our faith, physically journey through it, and find ourselves on the path to our ultimate destination? In just a few short weeks, Bishop Senior will be leading a pilgrimage from our diocese to the National Eucharistic Congress in Indianapolis. And today, I'm excited to welcome back Spiritual Director Donna Gilberti, who has led pilgrimages all over the world, to talk about how God curates our journey towards Him just for us. Donna, welcome back to the program. I feel like it hasn't been very long since we saw you last, but I'm really excited to have you back because last time we talked briefly about how you've been planning pilgrimages for almost a decade and have gone on several yourself. So I feel like you're the perfect person to talk to about pilgrimages today.
Well, thank you, Rachel. It's so nice to be back with you today. And this happens to be something that is so dear to my heart. So thank you for the invitation to come and discuss pilgrimage.
So let's dive into what a pilgrimage is. How is it different from like a vacation? And why have people been going on them for millennia? And what are they really seeking when they go?
Sure. Well, the easiest way to explain pilgrimage is that it is a physical journey where a person usually travels to a destination of significant religious significance. And the intention, as one writer describes, is a voyage of self-discovery and a search for something greater and beyond oneself. So it's not a modern day construct. And if we think about it, as long as man has existed and as part of our very human condition, man has longed to connect his inner spirit with its higher power. And today we as Christians who call our higher power God, think about pilgrimage as an inner journey that seeks to discover a new dimension of our relationship with God and the three persons of the Holy Trinity. But it's important to note that people of different faiths also set out on pilgrimage. So, for instance, our Jewish brothers and sisters might choose to visit Israel for one of their three traditional pilgrimage festivals of Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. Our Muslim brothers and sisters may make the Hajj, which is their annual pilgrimage to Mecca. Buddhists journey to four primary sites, including a location called Lumbini, which is the birthplace of Gautama Buddha, otherwise known as the Buddha. And so you can see that in many, many different traditions, we as humans are all interconnected by that inner spirit that seeks a relationship with our higher power. And in our ancient Christian tradition, the three oldest pilgrimages are those to Jerusalem, Rome, and the Camino de Santiago de Compostela, or the Way of St. James in Spain. And Jerusalem has been and will no doubt remain the most significant Christian pilgrimage site because, as the ancient scholar Origen so eloquently stated, it is there that we are able to walk in the footsteps of the Master. Then Rome, of course, is where the church had consolidated and organized, and today is the cradle of Christianity. And then in the 9th century, the remains of the Apostle James were found in Spain and are now interred in a crypt below the cathedral in Santiago de Compostela. And in fact, St. James happens to be the patron saint of pilgrims.
Oh.
Yeah. And I love St. James. He's just one of my personal patrons as well. Because the practice of pilgrimage is so ancient, several pilgrimage routes, in fact, including the Camino de Santiago and Japan's Kumano-Kodo, are on the UNESCO list of World Heritage Sites. They are that old and that ancient and have such profound meaning to the places in which they're located. So when we think about pilgrimage today versus what it used to be, we know that in the earliest days, pilgrims would literally walk out of their front door with nothing more than a knapsack, and they were seeking places where martyrs' blood was shed. They would visit the shrines or burial places of saints or places of healing and reported miracles. But if you think about ancient days, pilgrim routes naturally were poorly marked. Pilgrims were frequently preyed upon by bandits, and there were often disruptions simply due to war and disease. But one glimmer of relief that was most profound during that time was the hospitality that was offered by the religious orders of the time, because it was believed that whoever received pilgrims receives St. James and God himself. So when you see the imagery of St. James, he's usually depicted wearing a wide-brimmed hat and carrying a staff from which a gourd is hanging. And in the olden days, that would have held water. But today, because the pilgrimage experience goes back for at least 2,000 years, there are literally thousands of pilgrimage routes that crisscross the globe. Most of them are in Europe and the Middle East, but there are thousands of pilgrimage routes. And with the modern day church approval of Marian apparitions around the world, those shrines have also become pilgrimage destinations. Now, interestingly, and I find this fascinating, that here in the United States, although Christianity is declining, so we hear in numbers, the idea of pilgrimage is actually beginning to flourish in new ways within our own country. So that's exciting. That's a positive move. Then, Rachel, when we consider the personal dimension of pilgrimage, in the same way that each human being has been created with unique DNA that can't be replicated, it's the same thing with pilgrimage. Every pilgrimage unfolds in an equally unique way, with no two ever being identical, because we have to think about the fact that our soul and our spirit are involved. So you and I, Rachel, we may travel together on the same pathway, and we might both enjoy the same journey together. But, and I'm going to use this term, God will curate an experience. Now, some people might kind of snicker at that, but I believe God curates an experience that he has customized in a particular way that meets the needs of our soul. My soul is different than yours, so he will give you a different experience than he will give me, even if we're on the same pathway. And the wonderful thing about pilgrimage is that there really are no rules and there's no limitations. So the spiritual dimension that you want to get from a pilgrimage can be as intense or as light or as active or passive as you desire. It can be short, it can be long, it can be local, or a long distance away. You can also repeat a pilgrimage anytime you'd like to do so, and God will give you a different experience every time. You may prepare for a very long time beforehand, or you can just decide to go on a whim, like a lot of people do these days. They hop in an airplane, take off, and they're on pilgrimage. So your reason for going might also be very simple, or it could be quite complex, and it may be something that you've mulled over in your mind for a short time, or it could be something that has been in your heart for years. Only you know that. You can choose to spend a single day somewhere, walk hundreds of miles on a penitential journey, or allow someone else to lead the way for you. But in whatever way that you choose to approach pilgrimage, the spiritual goal is to open yourself to a very personal encounter with God.
I love that word curate, because it's such an appropriate term, because like you said, you could go on a pilgrimage several different times throughout your life and have a different experience each time. And you could be going with the same people every time if you wanted to. And every person is going to have their own unique experience. So curate is such the perfect word for that, to describe that experience. And the last time we spoke, you had mentioned that you planned and led pilgrimages for several years. Can you walk me through some of those experiences? Like, where were some of the places that you traveled to and why?
Well, I think that one of the most fascinating things in life of discipleship is that when you intentionally turn your life over to God to use in whatever way that He chooses, He'll come up with the most fascinating ways to move you from point A to point B, things that you never saw coming. And I never intended to be a pilgrimage guide. That was nowhere on my radar. And in fact, everything that was happening in my life at that time opposed it even being able to happen. But this is where the cool stuff comes in. God had completely different ideas. And so here's a little bit of the background about how that all came about. As I may have shared with you before, there was a time in my life when I was a young single mom with 2 small children, and we were going through a really devastating time. We had lost our home. I was absolutely penniless, and I had arrived at a point of such profound desolation that I wasn't even sure at that time that God truly existed. I couldn't believe that He was still out there if these things had happened to me. That's a very common response, but I didn't know it back then. And it's important to know, too, that at that time, although I had a great love for the Blessed Mother, I knew very little about Marian apparitions. So in 1998, when I was going through this very dark time, my father introduced me to one of his favorite places in the world, which is the National Shrine Grotto of Our Lady of Lourdes in Emmitsburg, Maryland. Now, I had never been there. I just knew it was one of my mom and dad's favorite places. But as soon as I stepped through the gates, I immediately knew that I was on holy ground. I was completely consumed with that feeling that there was something profound that was happening there. And although I felt that I had been abandoned by God, I was able to pour myself out to my Mother Mary, and I found myself returning to the grotto repeatedly over and over and over. And every time I went, I found that there was a reason that I was supposed to be there. It was a conversation that I would have somebody, someone who I would meet, something that I would see, an experience that was going on. But I always learned something new through that experience. Well, the following May, so this was maybe about 9 to 12 months later, the following May, my mom gave me a book by an author by the name of Wayne Weibel about reported apparitions of the Blessed Virgin Mary in a tiny village in Bosnia-Herzegovina called Medjugorje, which I had never heard of before. And it was reported that 6 children had allegedly been seeing apparitions of the Blessed Virgin since 1981, and it was still continuing. So, Rachel, as I read that book, I felt like I had been completely hit by lightning. I finished reading it in 2 days, couldn't put it down, kept pouring through it, and I was immediately convinced that I had to go there. Now, that was not my normal reaction for things. I didn't just jump into things very quick like
well,
that.
You can't when you have small children. There's so much planning involved.
Well, I just knew that I had to go there. But again, I had no money. I had no idea how that would ever happen. I just knew that one day I would go there. Well, a few weeks later, I was absolutely stunned to see an announcement in my parish bulletin about an upcoming pilgrimage going to Medjugorje. And so I immediately phoned the organizer. I told her I couldn't afford to travel, but I asked her to send me a brochure so that if I could ever find the money to go, I'd know how to reach her in the future and what the details were. So a few days later, the brochure arrived in the mail with a handwritten message. It said, "Donna, I hope this is the time." And knowing in my heart it wasn't going to be the time, I put it in a drawer, tucked it away, and I just prayed that someday I'd be able to afford to go. Well, 6 months later, it was November 1st, All Saints' Day, and I received a phone call from her asking if I was still interested in going to Medjugorje. And I laughed and I said, well, yes, of course I'd like to go, but I still don't have any money. And she said, don't worry about it. There's someone who has been there and was so moved that he wants to give the gift of a pilgrimage to someone who can't afford it. Now, I learned that the trip was only 9 days away and I did not have a passport. Someone else was scheduled to go, but she now needed to cancel, and I was going to be her replacement. So it took me 8 days and 2 trips to Philadelphia to procure a passport. And on day 9, I was sitting on an airplane. Everything had come together seamlessly, which, of course, now I know is the way that God works. You know, everything had come together perfectly. So on my first day in Medjugorje, it also happened to be my birthday. And we were in a small enclosed courtyard listening to a meditation by one of the reported visionaries who was speaking about the enormity of God's love for his children. And as I was listening, I hope I don't cry when I say this, as I was listening, I vividly heard an interior message that said, now that you are turning a page in the book of your life, I'm going to show you what I want you to do with the rest of your life. And Rachel, at that moment, I burst into tears and I just broke down sobbing because I had heard that message loud and clear. And I was filled with the most profound love that I had ever known. And in that moment, I knew that God was real and that he was present. And after having been away from the sacrament of reconciliation for 10 years, I went back to confession. And I felt absolutely cleansed by the burden that I had carried for almost a decade. It was so profound. By the end of that 9-day pilgrimage, not only did I walk away absolutely certain that there is truly a God in heaven, but I immediately knew how much he loved me as a beloved daughter. And I returned home from that first trip completely changed as a woman. Now, the following May, so this was only 6 months later, I received a call out of the blue from the pilgrimage organizer who asked if I would like to return to Medjugorje. And I started laughing and I said again, well, of course I'd love to go, but I still don't have any money. And she said, don't worry about it. It's taken care of. Someone read your thank you letter and wants to pay for you to go again. So 3 weeks later, I was sitting on an airplane headed back to Bosnia. And at this time, God had begun transforming my life in powerful ways and was speaking to my heart about a new pathway that I couldn't see, but I felt him moving, and I knew that I wanted to follow where it was that he was leading. This particular trip happened to be during the season of Pentecost, and at 3:30 a.m. on Pentecost morning, in June of the year 2000. My roommate and I, against our leader's wishes, my roommate and I went out in the dark with our flashlights and we climbed Cross Mountain so that we could be at the foot of the 30-foot tall cross at sunrise. And we stood at the top of the mountain. We were the only people there as the sun began to rise and the roosters began to crow. And I pressed my palms and my forehead against the foot of the cross. And in that moment, I completely turned my life over to God. You see, because during that past year, he had shown me the power of his presence. And I promised that for the rest of my life, I would do anything that he asked of me. Well, when I returned home, I knew that life would never be the same again, and I began to undertake the apostolic work that he began to spread out before me. And one of those things I had shared with you earlier when we met last time, that I was leading women's prayer groups and so forth. And I was organizing women's days of prayers at the Grotto of Lourdes in Emmitsburg. I was taking my women's groups to the grotto. And another thing was coordinating parish trips to the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C. for annual pilgrimages. And what I discovered was I loved being the conduit that got people to the meeting place where they could encounter God in a new way. And several years later, I had finally saved some money. Things were on the right track. I saved some money, and I decided to return again to Medjugorje on my own as a way of thanking God and the Blessed Mother for transforming my life. And while there, I learned that the pilgrimage guide, whom I had traveled with before, could no longer travel because of physical problems. And I heard God asking me to step into the role. So I picked up the mantle, and for the next 7 years, I organized and led pilgrimages to the Shrine of Our Lady, Queen of Peace in Medjugorje. And I had the beautiful opportunity to witness God transforming the hearts of others, just as he had done with me.
I love that. It goes back to that whole God is a God of surprises. Like, we can't see the whole staircase, but God knows which step is coming next. And it's funny because there's this saying in sales that, like, if you have to force it, it's not supposed to be. So I've kind of like taking that, especially in the last couple of years of my life, of just like, if I have to force it, then I'm not supposed to be doing it. And then the minute I give it up, it's like, oh, that weight off your shoulders because you're forcing something that's not supposed to be. So when you give in, when you relinquish that control, because as humans, I feel like we do nothing but try to control our circumstances. Really, we have zero control. Then like everything just kind of naturally falls into place. So that's really fascinating that you went from being a conduit for pilgrimages to now being a conduit as a spiritual director to helping people get closer to God, right where they are. And I think that's fascinating. Talk to me a little bit about that impact. How has going on these pilgrimages strengthened your role as a spiritual director? Because this is still a fairly new role for you, right?
Sure, right. So in December, we finished our 3-year formation program in the Ministry of Spiritual Direction. So I've, quote, officially been a spiritual guide for, 5, almost 6 months now. And it's beautiful. I meet at this time with 6 ladies. And each is different and unique in her own way and beautiful. But I do see that my pilgrimage experiences has impacted my ability to do that. Number one, I'm very comfortable talking to people. I have no problem meeting new folks and beginning conversations. And part of that was developed as a spiritual guide, just meeting new strangers and welcoming them into a new situation and getting them to open up about why they were on pilgrimage. Same thing with spiritual direction. You start that conversation, you sit across from a table, smile, chat, have a great conversation, but you know that God is in the middle of it and he's in control. One of the things that I did learn, though, through those years was that I every day can see God's divine providence constantly in play, with some of the things that I shared with you about how things fell together. I came to learn very quickly that when something truly is of God's will, kind of like what you were talking about with the sales experience, when something truly is of God's will and we are willing to submit our will to His, He breaks down every single barrier that's in the way and makes the impossible possible. And I like to be able to share that with people that I'm talking to. The other thing is, through these experiences, I have developed boundless trust that things don't always have to go my way, that I don't have to have all of the answers, because I know that if I turn to Him and I trust that He's got control of the situation, it will be the right thing. The other thing that I have learned through these experiences, that I've learned to recognize the voice and movements of the Holy Spirit and to listen to His guidance and to discern when it is the voice of the Spirit speaking to me versus another voice that I shouldn't listen to. And I like to be able to impart that in spiritual direction as well. And one of the biggest things is that I have really learned not only to recognize, but to be empathetic to the suffering of others. And so many people who go on pilgrimage are suffering in some way. You may not see it on the outside. People are wounded internally as well.
Sure.
But you can pick up on what's happening very quickly once you begin to work with people on a regular basis. And you pick up on the small little signs of that woundedness that may be going on.
We've unfortunately run out of time, but if you'd like to hear the rest of this episode, you can listen to us anytime on Spotify under Candid Catholic Convos, or you can download this episode from our website at hbgdiocese.org. Thank you so much for listening. Our goal at the Diocese of Harrisburg is to walk with you on your faith journey. So if this episode resonated with you in any way, the easiest way to show your appreciation is by sharing this program with your network or by leaving a review on your listening platform. You can also support us financially by making a donation online at hbgdiocese.org/DAC and clicking the Make a Donation button. Thanks again, and we'll see you at church on Sunday.